Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com. The program called What's Going On, and we come on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Mondays, and we're still around at 3 o'clock. I was telling Facebook before we started to tape that I hope that you will tell your friends about the program. We're trying to grow our audience, and we're trying to speak to a much wider base. Right now, we're doing pretty good. We have a lot of viewers that are, in fact, tuning us in. And we hope you will stay tuned until the program is over today, and make sure you stay tuned to all the programs here at allpointstv.com. I want to thank Mr. Paul Herring. We are, in fact, partnering with his studio over there on University Drive, and we want to thank you, Paul, for being a partner. And we are looking for other partners to join this network as well. And we're just trying to do some things that will edify the studio here and what the community is doing, and hope you will be a partner with us. Today, we are going to talk about a few things related to this ongoing impeachment fiasco in Washington. They're going to have the open hearings after a lot of complaints about it. We were saying that they got the hearings behind closed doors, and that can only mean that they're trying to hide things from the American people. So now we're getting ready to have the doors open to the public, and we will be able to listen in on this impeachment probing that they've been doing now, going on, believe it or not, 3 years. Because this impeachment fiasco began to go into the zone that we're now finding it in. First of all, we're talking about it, and then it went into the zone, or where we see it right now, where they're actually probing with the committees, both the House Intelligence Committee, that is chaired by the incredibly corrupt Adam Schiff. And there's no better over there in the House Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by the New York Representative Gerald Nadler. And I can't tell which one is the worst, but both of them pretty bad. Really, in order to refer a matter to the Senate, it should come out of the House Judiciary Committee. And so it's very interesting that the probe tomorrow, the public probe tomorrow, the hearing, they're not even calling it an impeachment hearing, it's an impeachment inquiry. And that's interesting that they have not brought about any impeachment charge at this point. And so that is interesting to me, because you cannot use a committee and then use the committee to subpoena the president, because we have three co-equal branches of government, and that means the Congress, the judiciary, and the executive branch of government. You cannot have a committee of the House of Representatives doing a subpoena of anything in the executive branch, because it's not the whole body, or not even the body that is in fact constitutionally required to begin the impeachment process in Article 1, Section 2, which sets up the House. And for the committee then to act as if it can, through an inquiry, demand that the president send his people over to talk to the committee without an impeachment vote having been taken, that is not going to fly if we have the courts clear about the Constitution. I'm not so sure they're clear about it. You know, not when I heard this morning that the court has cleared for the victim of Sandy Hook, the shooting incident that occurred there. The court is saying that those that are the victims, whose family members were victims of Sandy Hook, they can sue Remington, the gun manufacturer, for the incident. And that is astounding, because if you can hold the gun manufacturers liable for what people do with the guns, and you understand that there are more people killed every year by the use of cars, if you apply that same standard to that which kills, then it means that every maker of anything in which weapons are used, or maybe not even weapons used, anything that's used to harm somebody is used. If you extrapolate the court's reasoning and apply it in other circumstances, then it means that you can employ liability into anyone that makes anything that can be used as harmful of anybody. And that's why, I don't want to say this on the air, but really that's why I don't think we can really follow the government anymore, because the government has become the enemy of the constitutional rights this country has, and we're losing liberty because of the government, as they're taking more and more of our rights from us. And at some point down the line, I don't know how far down the line it will be, but at some point down the line, we're going to have to confront the government. And it won't be the first time. That's what happened in 1861 when they confronted the government. Because the government had gotten out of control and was not doing that which was supposed to be done based upon the framers' ideas in 1787, and then adding to it a further restraint upon on the government in the so-called Bill of Rights, which really, if you read it very carefully, you'll see that that's not really a Bill of Rights. What it is further restraints upon power, because the framers, as I said before, were paranoid. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, in which they gained their independence from the British, they did not want to have power going out of control again. So then they were writing the first seven articles of the Constitution, and then which was really the separation of powers, the dividing it up between the Article 1, where you have the legislative branch of government set up, in Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3, the judicial branch of government set up. And they were allocating powers in three different quarters of the federal government and restraining it by not having one part of the government having all of the power institutionally embedded in that particular power center, but dividing it up between three different power centers was one way in which they tried to restrain government. And then they had other ways of doing it as well, in terms of the check and balance system, where you would have each of the branches checking on the other branch. And so the legislative branch would in fact make the law, but in terms of making the law, they must in fact confine their making of the law within the parameters of what the Constitution allows them to do. And there are restraints placed on it by the fact that there are certain powers that are allocated to the federal government, and powers that's not allocated to the federal government. Those powers are therefore retained by the states, which is very interesting, because the states are the ones that are giving the federal government its powers by being allocated to it. And then those powers that are not specifically allocated then are retained by those that are doing the allegation. And that would be the states. So it says that those powers that are not specifically referenced to the federal government and then not prohibited by the Constitution to the states are reserved to the states. Those are the reserved powers. So you have delegated powers, and then you have reserved powers. The powers that are not enumerated are reserved powers, and those powers are reserved to the states. Look at that very carefully, because the powers that are, first of all, housed within the states, sovereign states, all powers were housed within the states. But in terms of relinquishing those powers, they specifically relinquish some of the powers, or another way of putting it, they relinquish some of their sovereignty to the federal government and install that sovereignty in the federal government, with stipulations on it being those powers and not others that are not so delegated to the federal government or enumerated to the federal government. The states were the all-encompassing centers of power, but they would allocate some of it to a centralized government. And if we understood that, we would understand why it is that the federal government should not have the last word in terms of what the restraints are. I mean, when the government today, when I heard today that the Supreme Court has ruled that you could have the gun manufacturers held liable for the use of the guns, let me read something to you that's in the Second Amendment. Now, I'll just read the last sentence of it. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And it doesn't say should not. Should is like there is as much cause to act on this side of it as to act on another side of it. But it should not. So if you do it because you take the should do it, you're not any more wrong in if you don't do it, because it's not compelling. But in terms of shall not, that's compelling. Shall not be infringed, the right to keep and bear arms. So if you have the court ruling about a suit of the gun manufacturers, that is an infringement. And it's not anything unusual about them infringing the Second Amendment, because if you in fact have a licensing of the right to bear arms, if it's licensed by the state, that's an infringement. If you in fact put a tax on it, TAX, if you tax that's an infringement. So it's like they don't really respect the Constitution, isn't it? Because if you have the court, the court, you go to the court, the Supreme Court, as a final arbiter between the rule of law and those who are to carry out the law. The last voice that we are supposed to listen to is the Supreme Court, who is supposed to be the arbiters of the issues, because they are the ones that are reading the Constitution and interpreting for the people who may not be able to understand all of the auspices of what the Constitution requires for the people to do. But when I see them doing what they're doing, they are not very good custodians of the Constitution, and therefore the question comes up of whether or not they need to be obeyed if they're not obeying the rule of law in terms of that's what's found in the constitutional document. And that's a question that we have to raise if they continue to make these kinds of rulings, because we've been there before. And that's why I said before the South was right, because the South saw that what the federal government was doing was injurious of the restrictions placed upon the federal government by the states. And then the states, starting out with South Carolina, stood up to maintain states' rights. And what are the states' rights? The rights of the state to delegate to the federal government what authority it has. And it was not the Sassoon authority, it was not given to it. And that's why the South sought to succeed using the Declaration of Independence as the argument that says that when any government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was in fact created, it is the right of the people to alter or even to abolish that government. And the South was not attempting to abolish the government, by the way. It wasn't attempting to destroy the government. It was attempting to succeed from it, because it had no longer lived up to the contractual terms that were there at the founding of the country. And once it began to become violative of those restraints, then South Carolina, and then followed by 6 other states, decided to in fact secede from the Union, because they came in the Union under certain conditions, and those conditions were in fact being violated. Eventually, there will be 11 states that will go out and secede from the Union. And because they had the right to do so, based upon the fact that they had voluntarily relinquished their sovereignty, some of it to the federal government, then if it behooved them to act otherwise, because it's a voluntary behoovement of those powers to the federal government, then of course, if it behooved them to do otherwise, they can in fact take those powers back and then do other than what they had done. They had not in fact said that this was to be done in perpetuity. There were certain conditions based upon it. And the conditions were that whenever any government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was created, then it was the right of the people and the states in which the people reside therein to in fact take back those terms if those terms were violated by the central authority that had been created by the states. And don't forget now, the states created the federal government and not the other way around. That's very clear from the documents. So we are now back at, if this government is continuing to go out of control, we're back at that point again. And these challenges that are being thrown up there is what are the American people going to do about it? Because we just cannot sit around and wait for the federal government to bring about the enslavement of the American people. And we sit here waiting for them to do that. The encroachment upon the rights of the people, as determined by what is placed in the governing documents of the country, created by the framers. We cannot allow anyone to dismiss what we have in place put there by the framers. And Roberts, the Roberts Court, and others that going along with these kinds of things. In fact, what they're doing in the legislative branch, what they're doing right now with impeachment, which I don't think, I have to be honest with you, I don't think they understand it. I don't think that the members of the court understand this, the Constitution to the point of understanding impeachment. There's no reason to believe that members of the House of Representatives understand it, because if they understood it, they would understand that you cannot begin to subpoena based upon the inquiry. You can't have two committees made up of how many people that would in fact subpoena the executive branch of government. How do you do that? A committee, not even the whole House, but a committee can subpoena the executive branch of government and reach into the executive branch and pull out its members in an impeachment inquiry, which is not the same thing as impeachment. It's astounding that's going on. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 says the House shall choose its Speaker and shall have the sole power of impeachment. It doesn't give that to the House Intelligence Committee, and it doesn't give it to the House Judiciary Committee. It gives impeachment to the total House. And that means that in order to have a subpoena issued to the executive branch, you have to have the House of Representatives doing the subpoena. You can't have a fraction of the body telling the whole executive branch what to do, because the executive branch is whole, and you have a fraction of the legislative branch ordering you have a fraction of the Congress ordering. It's not even a fraction. It's a fraction of a fraction, because the whole Congress is both the House and the Senate. At least in the Constitution, it does require the House to bring about impeachment, but they're not even doing that. They have a fraction of the House ordering the executive around. I mean, this is ludicrous. And they're talking about and I hear these members of the Democratic Party saying that they want to protect democracy. They're afraid that we're losing our democracy. And they're so saddened by having to do what they're doing in terms of impeachment. But if they don't do it, we're going to lose democracy because Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. They're not a threat to it. Donald Trump is a threat. You know, I wrote a post. You know, this is preposterous. If we had lawmakers and not lawbreakers, and if we had a Supreme Court that was worthy of the name Supreme Court, we would not have this banditry that's taking place, because we have bandits. But this is banditry. And I wrote an article on Facebook, which nobody has written what I wrote, in the sense of the claim that I made about what they're really doing there. And the claim that I made is this, is that after they could not make anything Donald Trump did that they were claiming was illegal, since nothing that they were claiming they could pin on the president because he wasn't doing anything illegal. That's why the Mueller report came back after $30 to $40 million being spent with no finding of any collusion with Russia. And there was no obstruction of justice found by the Mueller report. So then what did the Democratic Party do? And one of the most clever things that has been done in this whole 3-year fiasco, what they did was make the legal illegal, so that if Donald Trump is in fact doing his job as the executive office holder of the United States, to act even as president becomes an illegality. And that's what quid pro quo is about. Because we've never had in the history of this country aid given to foreign countries and then don't put strings attached to it. If you doubt that, go and read about what he talked about, dollar diplomacy. What was that, in fact, about? In other words, you're not just passing candy out here, you're passing out taxpayers' dollars. And the executive office holder has the responsibility to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And when you're delegating money to foreign governments, you have to make sure those governments are not corrupt, and that the money that we are giving in foreign aid should not be going for a corrupt purpose, because the purpose of the aid is in fact to do that which is not illegal. And the president has a responsibility of making sure that it's carried out. And we know that one of the most corrupt governments that you have in Europe, number one, is, of course, the most corrupt government is Russia. But the government that also, they say Russia tried to interfere with the election. Okay, they of course they do that in every election. But you can't extrapolate just because they tried to interfere with the election that they in fact were colluding with Donald Trump, which they're trying to act like it's quid pro quo, the same thing there. And they're not one and the same. Russia tries to interfere with every election this country has, and this country also interferes with other elections around the world, because that's what governments do.
Look at a Barack Obama.
But in terms of them saying that there was quid pro quo, there should be quid pro quo. The president should be involved in quid pro quo, because you must, in fact, make sure that the aid is going for that which is intended to go for.
Well, look at Barack Obama now. After he's not.
I can't hear you, John, because your mic is off.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Okay, never mind.
You're still off, but go ahead.
I was going to say, look at Barack Obama now. He's going around to other countries acting like he is the president.
Yeah, because that's not anything unusual. Have you noticed, John, that they stopped using quid pro quo now?
Yeah.
Something's wrong with we're not hearing the sound from from the booth.
Is that little light on that little light there thing there?
So maybe I should turn this up. Let me
yeah, turn that up a bit. Yeah, turn that up maybe.
Let's see.
Is there a green light on it? Can you see a light on it? Is there a light on the box? All right.
I'll turn them all up. Let's see.
Okay.
We're having some problems here with the communication, so we'll have to shut John's mic down because it's not coming through the feed. I'm not sure you can hear it in terms of WFOV, so we'll just have to close that down for this program. But what I'm saying here is that we always have had quid pro quo, because you have to put stipulations on your aid, because it is going. Make sure it's not going toward gangs. For example, if you're giving aid to some of these countries, the aid doesn't go to the people. It goes to the other, some of the illicit uses that are being made of it. And so, therefore, the president has a responsibility to make sure it's being directed in the ways in which it's in fact intended by the Congress that did the appropriation. That's the president's job. We're going to take a break right now. This is we're coming up on the 26-minute mark for WFOV, and I want to make sure they take their break at that time. So we're going to take a break with them at this point, and they'll be back in 4 minutes, and we are looking forward to them coming back after the break is over for that 4-minute period of time. Okay, with that in mind, we are going to continue what we're doing here, but they will be back with us in 4 minutes. You see, what they've done here is they made the president acting legally illegal, because they had tried all the legal things, and now that stuck. So what they've done here, and it's very clever, and I hope the American people are catching what they're doing now, is that they have made that which is legal illegal, so that the legal actions are now made a point of illegality. If the president even acts in his capacity as president, then that becomes impeachable based upon how they set the standards up, how they have rerouted it so that the president is really anything. So that what it really means is the president is damned if he does act and damned if he doesn't act. In other words, Donald Trump is wrong no matter what he does. It is really quite well. These are this is politics. This is the art of deceit. And the ones in Washington, probably more so than anywhere on the planet, are masters of it. We can say what we want to about these other governments around the world. We can say that this is not supposed to happen in America. America is an expert on it. And in fact, America may well have the only deep state on the planet. There's no deep state in North Korea. And there's no deep state in Russia. You don't have in those countries where they have a bureaucracy that's set up inside of the nation state as you have here. And I was trying to figure out, as a matter of fact, when did we begin to have what is called the deep state? And I'll tell you when I have determined, and I'm ready to be corrected, but I have determined that the deep state can be dated, and that the deep state began in 1913. When you set up when you did a number of things in that year. One of the more critical things was the rescinding of how we elect senators in this country. Okay, we are really glad that WFOV is back with us now, and they're back from their 4-minute break. I want to thank you for coming back. And we're not very far, as always, from where we were when you left. We wait for you to come back, and then we will continue with the rest of what we want to do today in the program. But I think it's 1913 when you have the deep state set up, because there were several things that happened in that year. One of which was the 17th Amendment was passed in that year. You know, we used to choose our senators, our national senators, 2 from each state, and we used to choose them by the state legislatures. Why? Because the senators were to be the state's representatives. When you understand the system that was put in place by the framers, you really don't want to mess with it, because it's such a well thought out system. And when you understand it, you are really in awe of the people in that room. I'm certainly in awe of them, because I cannot believe how they did this out of whole cloth, something that had never been done before. The states have their representatives. That's what was alleged. That's what they had done in terms of the state legislatures choosing the senators and sending them to Washington, D.C. But don't forget here, those that made the mistake in 1797 in impeaching William Blount, who was the senator from Tennessee. Don't forget that they did not understand that you cannot impeach a senator for the very reason of how the senators are in fact chosen. You see if you understand the Constitution, you're in awe of it, because you see how seamless it is. You can't impeach a senator. It's because the senators were selected by the states, not by the whole people, which is what the president is chosen by, and his vice president now on the ticket with him, not at the very beginning, but as of the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1803, well, added to Constitution 1804, but proposed 1803, you used to have the president and vice president chosen, separately. But look at what the problem was in terms of how it played out when you had Jefferson was the vice president under Adams, and they were from two different, one's a Federalist, one anti-Federalist, and the conflicts there. So then what they decided to do was to have the president and the vice president running as a unit at that time. So we have it a little bit different now. But the president and vice president are elected by the whole people, and they're the only elected office holders that are elected by the whole people. There are no other office holders that are elected by the totality of the voters in the country. So then what does that mean for the senators and the members of the House? They are voted in by the states. In the House of Representatives, it is the districts of the states. In the Senate, it is the whole state. And you have to look at this very carefully to see how seamless it is, because if you look at the impeachment process, for example, when you have the president under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, and it's not just the president, it's all civil officers of the United States, if the president, vice president, and all other civil officers of the United States, which means what? all the ones who, beside the president and the vice president, but all the ones that are appointed by the president. You see, all the civil officers of the United States are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. The senators and the members of the House are not appointed by the president, but they are elected by the states or within the states. And that's why you can't impeach them. Because the states did not delegate that authority to impeach its members because of their sovereignty, which they relinquished some of it, but not all of it, and they did not relinquish that the federal government could, in fact, assume authority over their representatives. I wonder if anybody understands that. I don't know. I really don't know. Not when they've been caught as some of the misconceptions they've had, because they were telling us before they started this fiasco with this impeachment, they were telling us that you had to have treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors in order to bring about impeachment. And that's not true either in what they're saying. That's not true. In order to bring about impeachment, you must have a majority vote in the House of Representatives that has the sole power of impeachment. And there are no stipulations of what that is based upon as far as impeachment as a process. It starts out in the people's body, but then if the impeachment takes place in the House, then because the senators are elected by the total state, wherein the members of the House are elected by the districts in the states, then the senators have authority over the House Representative. They have authority to come behind the House and will determine whether or not they will, in fact, sustain the House in its impeachment. You can see why they would do that, because we're talking about districts with the House of Representatives, the people's body. But with the Senate, we're talking about the total state, the state's representatives. And they changed that, didn't know what they were doing in 1913 when they did it, but changed that and then have the senators elected the same way that you elect members of the House. And if you're going to do that, be consistent with that. Because if you're going to elect the senators the same way you elect the members of the House, then it should be 2-year terms and not 6-year terms. The 6-year terms was intended to give the senators, as representatives of the state, more tenure in office than they give to the president. Look at that for the primacy of the states. Because the members of the House, the districts in the states, 2-year terms. The president, a 4-year term. Senators, 6-year terms. The primacy of the states and states' rights. And they're trying to act today as if states' rights mean that they are trying to bring back segregation. No, we're trying to bring back the rule of law. We're trying to bring back constitutional government in this country. And the states really should band it together, and if the Supreme Court makes a ruling to which 2/3 of the states disagree, then they should have the authority to then tell the Supreme Court that that's not going to fly. And if we had the Constitution being followed, that's what would happen. This ruling where the court is telling us that Remington is responsible for a shooting because somebody took a gun and applied it in a way in which it was not intended to be applied by the manufacturer, nor that they, in fact, have anything to do with how it's used once it had been manufactured. If you're going to go down that road, then anything that's used as a weapon, then the weapon maker is liable for it. Or if it's used as not intended as a weapon, but it's used in that regard, makes it actionable. If they are, in fact, consistent with it. But the court is not consistent. That's why it's overturning his own verdict sometimes, because it say one thing in one era, say something else in another era, because the court is not consistent in his own rulings. Overturning different things that happened in the 19th century, same document, interpreted differently by different courts, not because the language has been changed, but the court has determined there's no longer going to follow the earlier rulings. Because because we have an outlaw court in this country. And you see that going on all the time in terms of rules that they make. But anyway, one thing that they did in 1913, I think the deep state can be traced to that year. So one thing that created the deep state was to lessen the authority of the states. And they did that by, in fact, having the senators no longer representing the states. It represents they vote the senators in the same way they vote the members of the House in. And that means what they should have done to be consistent, they should then have reduced their terms. You can't have a 6-year term for senators and they no longer have the intent being what it was when we had 6-year terms. They have 2-year terms. Therefore, the intentions of the senators have been changed by them being elected by the people of the states, not by the state legislatures. So they stopped being representatives of the states. And that's why you have the deep states out of control, deep state out of control, because the states no longer can be over and the purview over the federal government, which was what was intended. So if it goes out of control, the states could act as a check upon the federal government. Right now, they are clients of the federal government. Hope you understand that. And that's where the problem is. And that begins to happen, that going out of control, the deep state starts out in that year. If it just been that particular part of it, that would be bad enough, but it doesn't stop there. Because in the same year, they passed the Federal Reserve Act. And they amended the Constitution, which allowed the federal government to do what was not intended by the framers, and that was to invoke a federal taxation policy upon the American people. That was never intended, to have the federal government reach into the pockets of the American people and tax their income. That was never the framers' idea, because they understood the power to tax is really the power to destroy, and it gives the power of the government to go out of control, which is done now. The federal government is totally out of control. And it will take the states to go back to re-establishing its power so that it can rein in the excesses of the federal government. And that's what the South was trying to do. This idea that they were trying to hold on to their slaves is pure nonsense. Their slaves are never in danger of being taken off those plantations by the federal government in the first place, because the federal government was enforcing it. And if they were not enforcing it, what was the fugitive slave law about in 1850? What was the Kansas-Nebraska bill about in 1854? And what was the Missouri Compromise about in 1820? The federal government had no proclivities toward ending slavery in this country. And nobody can show a document where it says that. You can't even point anything out in terms of what Lincoln said in his first inaugural address. There's nothing in the document. Go read it for yourself about what Lincoln said on March the 4th, 1861. This was not a war to end slavery. That was a consequence of the war. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves. Slavery ended after the war was over, not during the war. The Emancipation Proclamation was inapplicable during the war because it only applied to the slaves in the states that were at war with the Union states. And the slaves that were in the Union states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Virginia. Let me get that right. Not Virginia. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and what's the other state there? One other state, Delaware. Those 4 states had slaves. There were a total in those 4 states of between 500 to 800,000 slaves. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not speak to nor touch the slaves in those states, nor did it touch the slaves in the states that it succeeded, because they were fighting against the Union. Why would they, in fact, abide by the Emancipation Proclamation when they were, in fact, fighting against the Union, of which Lincoln was a representative of? The South had its own president, Jefferson Davis. So that idea of this war being over slavery is nonsense. They were fighting to bring the Union back under the umbrella of the Constitution of the United States. And when I read some years ago the Confederate States Constitution, I was stunned to read it, because that Constitution is the same Constitution that the framers drew up in 1787. It reads the same way. There are very few words that are different in it. The Constitution is the same document. I don't mean exactly the same. I'm saying if you read one, you're practically reading the other. Because what they were doing was reiterating what the framers had put in place, but they intended to follow to the letter of that which was written, to correct what they were doing in Washington at that point. Because Washington was not following the Declaration of Independence and was not following the constitutional restraints upon government. And they were going to go back and perfect it. And they picked up their muskets to back up their succession from the federal government. And the bayonet said otherwise. That's also a part of losing freedoms in this country, because the right to succeed was another way of restraining government, because they knew that if they got out of power, then the states could withdraw their support. And that was another one of the restraints intended by the framers. It's just amazing to me that we want to challenge the framers with the people that are running for power talking about they want to undo that which was put in place by the framers. For example, they're talking about the Electoral College. They don't understand the Electoral College. If they understood it, they would not bother it. Because the Electoral College is brilliantly put in place by the framers because they did not want the President of the United States elected by a single faction in this country. Because factions, F-A-C-T-I-O-N-S, factions are very dangerous. But at the same time, they did not want to repress factions. The factions have a right to exist. And so now you have to figure out how to allow factions to have their right to exist, they have the freedom to exist. At the same time, factions have to be restrained. Because if you have a majority faction, it will in fact use its majoritarian voice to oppress the minority voice, because its voice is able to overwhelm the minority voice. So how do you do that? Protect the rights of the majority, at the same time, protect the right of the minority voice to be heard. Because both of them are factions. And what they did, and you can go and read about it in the 10th Federalist paper, the two greatest of the Federalist papers being number 10 and number 78. Go read 78, which deals with the court, what was intended by the federal court system, and see if you can spot in the framers. This is written by Alexander Hamilton, who wrote 51 of them. 51 of the Federalist papers written by Alexander Hamilton. Go read 78 and see if you see anything that Roberts is doing based upon the 7th to 8th Federalist paper. And then number 10 deals, which is also written number 10 is written by James Madison. Number 9, which began this discussion about factions, was written by Alexander Hamilton. But that discussion was picked up by James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and then he picked it up and then carried it a little bit further. How do you fix the problem of factions? But the question was opened up by Alexander Hamilton, but James Madison finished it in terms of having written about how they did it. And how they did it was to create 50 majorities. Well, it wasn't 50 then, it was 13. 13 majorities. But you got 50 majorities right now. And the brilliance of it is that no single majority can become dictatorial because it's being checked by other majorities. I don't know if you understand how great this was to put that in place. And then they have the impeachment process, where you have the impeachment where it starts in the House, but the Senate can check on the House. And it cannot do what you're doing, Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina. You know, South Carolina was the first state that rose up against the federal government because of its excessive power. And this man is in the state that rose up to hold the federal government to account. And now, this many years later, we got a person in that state that's violating what South Carolina stood for, what they stood up for. He's telling the House that what they're doing is inappropriate. Does he understand Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5? Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 says, the House shall choose its Speaker and shall have the sole power of impeachment, not the Senate. You know, it makes you want to scream. Because I'm going to tell you something. This is the honest gospel truth. The Constitution is in exile in this country. The words are there, but neither the legislative branch of government, the lawmaking body, nor the judiciary in Article 3, the law interpreting body, neither one of them follows the Constitution and neither one of them respects it. And that's why we have got to get the states to stand up again. And I don't mean militarily stand up like they did in 1861. In fact, they didn't stand up militarily at the beginning. They stood up based upon the documents at the beginning. But when Lincoln called for 75,000 troops and placed them in the South, that's when the South used the Second Amendment of the United States. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And when the federal government sent its troops into the South, they were in fact confronted by the militias of the states. That's what happened. And that's what's being hidden by these politicians. The states, you got to stand up. That's your inheritance. And we've got to restore order in this country, and the only ones can do it are the states. And impeachment is in your hands right now. Okay. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.